I was gonna get some beer. I should have. It's a great way to start this off.
Wonderful.
Hey, this is Alan with GameLark, and I'm doing a new episode of GameLark Chats. This time with Psychotrip, and he is a YouTuber. Well, I'll let him introduce himself.
Hey guys, Trip here. I am a YouTuber. I run the channel Psychotrip, where we talk about video games, mostly video games, also a bit of movies and comic books, nerd stuff. That's the type of stuff we talk about. And yeah, I focus on atmosphere and immersion and character development and narrative in, well, mostly video games.
That's right. And I actually discovered Psychotrip through a Reddit post about Morrowind. So he has a lot of videos on the Elder Scrolls series, and I thought it'd be a great idea for him to come and chat with me about the soundtrack because, as many people know, Elder Scrolls has a really powerful and moving soundtrack that a lot of gamers enjoy. So we're going to be talking about it. We're going to be talking about three main points, which are the style, the functionality, and the evolution of the Elder Scrolls soundtrack. So, well, first of all, I'm gonna ask you, what do you think? What's the style of the soundtrack in your mind?
I mean, so I started with Oblivion. That was the first Elder Scrolls game I ever played.
Okay.
I went back to Morrowind later, and of course I've played Skyrim. But Oblivion, Jesus Christ, that I have that soundtrack on my phone. It's one of my favorite video game soundtracks of all time. And I guess to answer your question about the style, honestly, the style is really, I'm trying to think of another word except for generic because it's so incredible. I can't call it that. It's, I guess, classic, epic fantasy music.
Yeah.
And that's interesting considering, you know, what the Elder Scrolls is and how, even though a lot of people think it's just regular old fantasy, how far away from regular fantasy it is when you start reading up into the backstory. It's interesting how classic the music is, but it works because, honestly, all I can say is Jeremy Soule, the composer. It's the Oblivion. I can't tell how much of it is because I was pretty much raised on that game and how much of it is just because it's genuinely amazing music. But that music, that's the shit I listen to before I fall asleep at night. Like, there's something so warm, so soothing, so just peaceful about that music that I've never heard in anything else in my entire life. And all of Jeremy Soule's music, I guess, it's capable of giving you a certain feeling. Like, if I were to take the music of Oblivion and put it in Skyrim, it would change the entire game. Not the gameplay, but my entire experience. Yeah, the mood.
Right.
I'm just thinking about that now. That's how incredible that music is, because Skyrim is obviously has more of an epic feel to it. And that fits the more rugged, cold, both literally and metaphorically, tone and nature of your environment. Whereas Oblivion, in Cyrodiil, it's so much more warm and soothing, and it's amazing how much of that is due sheerly because of the music itself. And I guess it's a testament to just how important sound design is in video games.
Right. And you know, you didn't want to say it was generic, but I think a better term might be familiar, where it's something that immediately it's something, because you were saying there, you know, there are parts of the game that are a little bit more far out there, but it's something you hear and you immediately, I think it has somewhat of like a Celtic or medieval influence to it, where it just sounds like this ancient, like, kind of classic feel to it.
Yeah. Which game are you talking about specifically?
Well, all of them, but you're right that there is a lot of differences between the soundtracks, and especially with Skyrim. I think the differences between Morrowind and Oblivion aren't as great as, say, you know, Morrowind to Skyrim, and not just in terms of complexity. Skyrim really especially even from the first, you know, the first trailer, which we'll get into, but the first trailer where they did the Dragonborn theme song. But I think another word that might come to mind is cinematic. You know, it's something that And by cinematic, I mean it's more, you know, with video games, there really are different styles depending on the genre, right? RPGs kind of go for more atmospheric, less melody-driven soundtracks. And I think in main part because, one, it could get repetitive after a while, right? Whereas platformers and other types of games, you know, you're not playing for 50 to 100 hours, right? Exactly. And two, because it's not so distracting, it kind of allows you to relax a little bit, to breathe, to kind of explore the game. And then, like I said, we're going to get into the functionality, especially for this series. But for the most part, I mean, RPGs generally tend to have that more orchestral feel to them. Even comparing to something like, you know, Fable or Dragon Age, even those games have similar, I wouldn't say sounds, but similar, you know, orchestral. But I don't know, Sky, I'm trying to think of, like, what are the main differences if I had to compare those three series. Like, Fable, to me, has kind of like a whimsical soundtrack, you know what I mean? And Fable, Dragon Age is a little bit more serious. And then the Elder Scrolls, I don't even know where to throw that, like, how to compare that.
It's funny, you're naming three series that I love in different ways, but three series that I love. And three series that I love not only, but in part because of their music. Mm-hmm. So for Fable is, along with Elder Scrolls, perhaps my favorite. It has perhaps my favorite soundtrack ever.
Yeah.
And you're right. There is a sort of whimsical, lighthearted tone to Fable's music. And in an industry where we're so obsessed with being dark and gritty, Fable's music it's just so refreshing. Mm-hmm. Even when that game gets dark, even when that game gets serious, there's still that tether back to being a fantasy in the literal sense. Be something fantastic.
Yeah.
Something fun. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And for all of Fable's problems, I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording, that the atmosphere is something Fable consistently got right. And I think sound design, and I say sound design instead of just music, because music is just one part of sound design.
That's in a video
true.
Game. That's definitely true.
I really think that sound design, and that encompasses everything, is one of the most important things in regards to atmosphere in video gaming. Because if you were to put the music of, say, Oblivion or Skyrim into Fable, I would have an entirely different mindset going into that game.
It wouldn't really fit
and experience
either.
That game. It wouldn't fit. And that's another thing. That's another thing about how important the music and sound design is.
When you think about it, like Fable, like I said, the more whimsical music kind of fits, the more, like, it kind of has like a little bit cartoonish animations. Like they're not realistic by any means. You know what I mean? At least the first three games. I don't know. I don't know what they did with the other games. But and then Dragon Age, I'm trying to think of like how I would compare. Dragon Age for some reason in me doesn't grab me as much as the Elder Scrolls does for some reason.
Yeah, no, I'll agree. And
there's certain songs that are good, but it's not, on the whole, it's not like when you hear, you know, Dragonborn, or you hear songs from Oblivion or Morrowind. It's not the same. It seems even more in the background than those songs. I think, if anything, like the tavern songs are awesome in Dragon Age.
Tavern songs are great in every game. Can we just accept that? Like in World of Warcraft, another game that has, my God, incredible music. Also another game that I was basically raised on, so I might be a bit biased, but that tavern music, both the new tavern music and the old school tavern music, that it's almost like it's brainwashing me every time I hear it. And that's what good music does. I know that sounds scary.
No, but it conditions you to feel a certain way. That's what you said. It's emotional.
I can't escape it. I can't escape that warm, fun, I feel like I'm hanging out with my friends whenever I hear that music. And that's the feel you want from a tavern, you know what I mean?
Well, I think even in real life, that's like the old tavern songs would be based on that. Just trying to bring people together and, you know.
And to your point about Dragon Age, I'll definitely agree that the music in Dragon Age, I mean, it's good. Like, just objectively speaking, it's good music, but
It's not as memorable.
It has nothing on Jeremy Soule or Danny Elfman. Like you can't compare it. It's good music, but it's not even comparable to, again, the amount of brainwashing that happens in those other games we're mentioning. But yeah, I love Dragon Age. Just my basic personality demands that things just be completely balls out and batshit insane. That's just how I am. I grew up on the crazy lore of the Elder Scrolls, the stuff you don't see in the games, the stuff that you read about outside of the game.
Deep stuff.
Like the Elder Scrolls is probably one of my favorite fantasy universes of all time, but they had time to build up all of that lore. It wasn't until the game Redguard, the little known Elder Scrolls spin-off, that the current Elder Scrolls lore existed.
Okay.
Before that, in the first two games, Arena and Daggerfall, it was basically just a Dungeons and Dragons knockoff. And then these two guys called Michael Kirkbride and Kurt Coleman came along and said, fuck that shit, we're gonna make hermaphroditic demigods and awesome badass black dudes who can split atoms with their swords and cause nuclear explosions, just crazy shit like that.
Yeah.
Like, an entire, like, world building is meaningless if you don't have a solid narrative.
Right.
I think that's where, like, Skyrim falls flat for me. Because, and to be honest, to be perfectly honest, the only Elder Scrolls games that had great narratives, in my opinion, were Daggerfall, maybe Redguard, and Morrowind.
Okay. I would kind of agree with that. I mean, Oblivion wasn't bad.
No, Oblivion had a solid story, but it wasn't great. Like, Oblivion had a story that was just what it needed to be.
Yeah.
And Skyrim was just, Jesus Christ. That was... I have to applaud Skyrim for going a bit further back to the Elder Scrolls' roots, because my biggest problem with Oblivion is the atmosphere. Because here's exactly what happened. And I've actually spoken to, I haven't spoken to Todd Howard, but I've spoken to some of the other people behind the Elder Scrolls and what happened with Oblivion. And remember, what I'm about to say isn't biased, because Oblivion is one of my favorite games of all time. But
sure.
They'll tell you that Oblivion was the result of the Lord of the Rings movies. The atmosphere was the result of the Lord of the Rings movies. Like, we saw that. Like, if you look at it, like, if you look at the way Oblivion looked, it's like the actual realm of Oblivion as portrayed in the game Oblivion. It's just Mordor. If you look at the atmosphere of Cyrodiil, it's just Middle Earth. Like, they saw that shit and like, let's do that. And it pisses me off so much. And this is why I have a lot of mods that fix this. Cyrodiil was supposed to be like the weirdest province out of all of the Empire.
And it just kind of felt too generic.
Imperials were arguably the weirdest race out of all of them. Because originally, I don't know if you know this, but Imperials were supposed to be kind of Greco-Byzantine, Amazonian, jungle-dwelling, aristocratic weirdos.
Wow.
They were supposed to be this perfect cross between sophistication and savagery. Like, imagine, like, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire and all that weird architecture and shit.
Right.
Now, imagine that is in an Amazonian jungle. Now, imagine those Byzantine people are obsessed with Asian culture. They're not Asian, but they're obsessed with Asian culture.
Yeah.
Because Akavir in the Elder Scrolls is the analog for Asia.
Right.
So Imperials were like the weirdest group out of everyone in the Elder Scrolls.
Right.
And Cyrodiil itself was supposed to be like a jungle. It was supposed to be a giant jungle without any major roads, with rivers, and like, instead of like major roads like you saw in Oblivion, it was supposed to be rivers, and people would like sail on little like gondolas and stuff across the land. And it was supposed to be way, way weirder than what we got. But they retconned it all because, hey, Lord of the Rings is super popular. Let's, make it look like that.
Well, the funny thing is you're mentioning Lord of the Rings, and I think that you could kind of compare the Lord of the Rings, especially like the soundtrack, to Morrowind a little bit, or to the Elder Scrolls. I mean, like that it's that big like expansive soundscapes where it just the soundtrack feels large, right? And it kind of immerses you in an equally like large, and I hate to use the term, but epic world, right? And then I think that maybe you could kind of compare like Dragon Age to more like Game of Thrones, maybe, where it's a little bit like grittier and like, I mean, there's a lot of fucked up stuff in Dragon Age, and it's not, and like Game of Thrones has a few songs that are like really memorable, but for the most part, it's just there to serve the story. I don't know what Fable would be in terms of entertainment. Maybe like an older movie, like an older fantasy stuff.
In regards to fantasy, right now what's popular, there's two basic
Grimdark is
types.
one.
They're not even necessarily grimdark, but there's the political intrigue and that sort of thing. And then there's the classic high fantasy like Lord of the Rings.
Okay, yeah.
And Elder Scrolls, the reason why I always loved Elder Scrolls, especially Morrowind, is because it struck a balance. Elder Scrolls is just as much about elves and, you know,
gods and stuff.
Living gods and crazy mythology and magic as it is about political intrigue and, you know, the politics that go on between these living gods.
Except in Skyrim.
Their own personal motivations and hubris and all of that shit. And it's this perfect balance between the two of them.
Except in Skyrim.
Skyrim, yeah.
Because it's really...
And to be fair, Oblivion too. And one thing that I can say is that I remember Todd Howard actually said that his biggest regret for Oblivion was downplaying the political aspects of the Elder Scrolls. Because up until then, when the Elder Scrolls came into its own with, again, Redguard and Morrowind was when the series really became its own universe, they were very political stories. They were that perfect balance between high fantasy, all that weird, crazy, strange stuff that you wouldn't normally see in your own world, with that very human political narrative as well. And Oblivion was actually supposed to have an entire faction, a noble faction, where you could join the nobles and, you know, see how they're reacting to the Oblivion crisis and, you know, rise through the ranks and end up becoming a duke and, you know, interacting with the Elder Council and all of that. But they had to cut all of that, and you can still see small remnants of it, and that just shows you how late in development they removed it. Like, if anybody remembers Oblivion and remembers the scene, the quest where they have to save the city of Kvatch, where
that's like one of the early quests, right?
Yeah. Once you when you find the Count dead, the Count of Kvatch dead, and you pick up his ring, because the guy says, "Bring me proof of his death." You take his ring and give it to the head of the Kvatch guard. That was supposed to be the start of the noble quest line. You were supposed to take the ring and become the Count of Kvatch.
Huh.
All of that was cut.
Wow.
And one of Todd Howard's greatest regrets, he has two regrets. One that he doesn't talk about much, but one of the head writers, Michael Kirkbride, talks about was that he wishes that Cyrodiil had stayed a jungle.
That would have been cool.
That bizarre, strange Amazonian jungle with Byzantine inhabitants. And Todd Howard says his biggest regret is cutting the political aspects of Oblivion. But yeah, we're talking about music here, so...
That's a perfect segue to say, well, that kind of wraps up the style of the soundtrack. I mean, I guess all of these world-building aspects, and we were comparing different game series with Fable and Dragon Age, but the gameplay and the world obviously affects the sound. And I think there are some like strange parts of the music, but for the most part, I think that music is kind of a bridge. So it's kind of it doesn't want to be too far out there, so that you can like the player can be comfortable exploring. Do you know what I mean? Like if it was too crazy, it would be a little bit like maybe dissonant or something like that for the player when they're engaging the world.
Yeah, you especially see that in Morrowind, where as much as I love that music And it's so classic, and a lot of people are gonna kill me for saying this.
Then don't say it.
No, I'm gonna say it
because
I love Morrowind's music, but let's face it, the music didn't necessarily fit the environment.
No, you're right. And
Morrowind's music. Sorry, you're about to say.
No, I was just gonna say we could save a little bit of that for the next part, but finish your thought. We're gonna get into the functionality because Morrowind really, as we talk about the functionality in the different soundtracks, you'll see Morrowind is the simplest by far of all of them.
Yeah, because I mean, really listen to Morrowind's music, and if you listen to that music without the game, you would not for 1 second think that it takes place in this weird alien world where people herd jellyfish like cows and ride giant ticks and all sorts of weird shit like that. Like, you would expect some kind of weird electronica alien soundtrack to go along with that. You wouldn't expect the familiar fantasy music that goes along with it. Mm-hmm. So that's the point I was trying to make. That I think, to your point, they were maybe trying to ground it a bit more, give you something to latch onto.
Which is something that one movie did really well, which was Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, they used familiar... I don't want to go off into a tangent, but I'm just saying that is, in my mind, like a movie that did it really well, where they grounded to like it's a weird fantasy space, like adventure, but with really familiar music so that you are like, okay, I'm along for this ride. And I think that may be what Morrowind was trying to do. But maybe...
Definitely.
So that kind of wraps up the style, I think, of the soundtrack. So we're gonna go ahead and end this particular part of our discussion.